Imagine this. You've spent your whole life working, loving, and sacrificing for your children. You've given them everything you could. A home, your time, your support. But as the years go by, something begins to change. You're no longer the person they turn to for advice or comfort. You're an afterthought. Your presence a burden. Then one day your son, the one you raised, the one you've watched grow into a man, looks you in the eyes and says the words that will shatter everything you thought you knew about family. He tells you, "You're too poor to visit my new mansion." The words sting, but they don't break you. Instead, something inside you shifts. What if, instead of allowing his cruel comment to tear you down, you showed him just how wrong he was? What if you turned this moment of pain into something more powerful than he could ever imagine? This is the true story of a mother who, after years of love and sacrifice, decided she was done being invisible. Done being the forgotten one. The story of betrayal, heartbreak, and a silent revenge that no one saw coming. What happens when a mother, told she is nothing more than a burden, takes matters into her own hands? How far can one woman go to reclaim her dignity, her strength, and her place in her family's life? Stick with me, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about revenge, about family, and about the lengths we will go to for the people we love. And when the tables turn, you won't believe what comes next. But as the story unfolds and the pieces begin to fall into place, you'll realize this wasn't just a matter of getting back at her son. It was a journey of rediscovery. A journey that would change everything for both of them. Meet Mary, a woman in her 50s, standing with a quiet grace in the simplicity of her well-worn life. She was the rock her family leaned on. A mother of 2 grown children, a grandmother to 5, she had spent decades pouring everything she had into her family. She was the one who made the birthday cakes, the one who picked up the phone at all hours, and the one who always showed up at every school event no matter how small. Her life was one of quiet sacrifice, often giving her last dime to help others, putting her needs aside for the ones she loved. Mary had always believed in the concept of family above all else. The idea that love and support for one another were the only things that mattered in life. But over the past few years, something had shifted. Mary could feel it. Her children had grown older, their lives becoming more complex, their time less available. Yet it was her son Daniel who seemed to pull further away from her with each passing day. At first it was subtle, small comments, brief moments where he seemed less interested in her company. But then it escalated. When Daniel and his new wife moved into a grand mansion on the outskirts of town, it seemed like the culmination of everything he had worked for. But for Mary, it was like watching a piece of her heart slip away. For years she had been the one to support him, and now this was his reward for all those years: wealth, luxury, and a life that felt so far removed from her own modest one. But what hurt more than the material success was the distance that had grown between them. Mary had visited their new home once or twice, but she could tell she was out of place. Her old clothes, her modest demeanor, her simple lifestyle were starkly different from the polished, modern world Daniel and his wife now inhabited. She didn't belong there. At least, not in the way she once thought she did. Her son's attitude was beginning to mirror the extravagant life he was now leading. Daniel became distant, and Mary began to feel it, not just in his words but in his behavior. The visits grew fewer, the phone calls less frequent. It was as if her presence was a reminder of something he wanted to forget. And it wasn't until that one fateful day, when Daniel said the words that would haunt her, that Mary truly understood the magnitude of their separation. "You're too poor to visit me," Daniel had said, his words cold and dismissive. The way they hung in the air between them felt like a slap in the face. He didn't say it out of malice, or at least, Mary thought he didn't. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. That simple sentence felt like a dagger to her heart. And in that moment, Mary realized the truth. For all the years of love and sacrifice, for all the time she had put her family first, she was nothing but a burden to him now. A reminder of everything he had worked hard to escape. He had worked to build a life that excluded the likes of her. This wasn't the first time Mary had felt a rift between them. It wasn't the first time Daniel had made her feel like she didn't belong in his world anymore. But this time the hurt was deeper. The wound cut through her entire sense of self-worth. She had never imagined that one day her son, the child she had raised with so much care, would look at her and see only her lack, her shortcomings. He didn't see the love she had poured into him, the sacrifices she had made, or the years she had spent doing everything in her power to ensure his success. No, all he saw now was someone too poor to visit. Mary was faced with a brutal choice. Should she let this moment of betrayal break her, to accept that her place in her son's life was no longer significant, or should she take a stand and fight for the respect she had long been denied? This question consumed her as she sat in her small home that night, alone with her thoughts. Was her pride so important? Could she afford to walk away quietly, to continue living in the shadows of her son's new life? Or was there something deeper at stake here, her dignity, her sense of self, the very essence of who she was as a woman, a mother, and a person? Mary thought back to all the years of selflessness, the late nights when she had been there for him, the times she had gone without so that he could have more. Was that not worth something? Did it mean nothing in the face of his new riches? Could she just fade away, allowing this betrayal to define her, or could she, someone he once respected, someone he once loved, take control of her life and prove that she was far more than the woman he now saw as too poor? This wasn't just about her pride. It was about reclaiming what she had lost. A sense of worth, a place in her family, a role that mattered. The more Mary thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about proving Daniel wrong. It was about proving something to herself. She had spent her life sacrificing for others, putting their needs first. Now it was her time to live for herself. So Mary made a decision. It wasn't easy. It wasn't something she could do lightly, but it was something she knew she had to do. She wasn't going to let Daniel's cruelty and indifference define her. She wasn't going to fade into the background, no longer a part of her family's story. Mary had always been more than that. And now, it was time to show everyone, including Daniel, that the woman they had overlooked was about to rise from the ashes of their judgment. It was time to turn this moment of betrayal into something more, something powerful. The days after Daniel's cruel words felt endless. Mary tried to move on, to push past the pain, but it clung to her like a heavy weight, sinking deeper into her bones with each passing hour. She had always been the glue that held everything together, the one who made family gatherings happen, who took care of the little things that made everyone else's life easier. But now it felt as though she was being erased from the picture, pushed to the edges of her family's story like an old photograph tucked away in a forgotten drawer. Her daughter Lily tried to comfort her, tried to fill the silence that had overtaken Mary's home. But Mary knew that Lily, while well-meaning, didn't understand the depth of the betrayal. Lily had her own family, her own life, and while she loved her mother, she didn't truly know the pain that Mary was carrying. The wound left by Daniel's words was raw, and the loneliness was suffocating. Mary would spend her evenings staring at the phone, waiting for a call from either of her children, but none came. The silence was louder than any argument. The absence of contact felt like a deliberate erasure of her place in their lives. Her thoughts turned dark during those long nights. She started to ask herself, what had all those years of sacrifice been for? Had it really meant nothing? She had always been there for Daniel, pouring everything she had into his future. Yet now it seemed as though her very existence had become a burden to him, something to be swept aside in the pursuit of his new life. Mary began to look inward, to question the choices she had made, the life she had led. She realized that for too long, she had put others before herself, her own needs and desires always secondary to those of her family. And what had it brought her? Loneliness, heartbreak, and now abandonment. She wasn't just isolated from her son. She was isolated from the life she had worked so hard to create. It was in this solitude that Mary had her revelation. She had spent her whole life caring for everyone else. She had devoted herself to raising her children, nurturing them, giving them everything she could. But somewhere along the way, she had forgotten to nurture herself. She had lost sight of who she was beyond being a mother, beyond being a caretaker. And as much as it hurt, this rejection from Daniel forced her to face that uncomfortable truth. She had given so much, and now, she had nothing to show for it. Except perhaps, the lessons she had taught her children. Lessons of love, of sacrifice, of selflessness. But she had never taught them the importance of self-respect, of standing up for herself, of not allowing herself to be discarded so easily. One warm afternoon, as the sun bathed the streets in golden light, Mary decided to take a walk through the neighborhood to clear her mind. The world seemed to move on around her, indifferent to the storm brewing inside her chest. Her footsteps were slow and heavy as she made her way down the familiar path, passing houses that she had once known as the backdrop to her children's childhood. Everything seemed so ordinary, so untouched by the storm inside her. But then, as if fate had placed it directly in her path, she saw it. The mansion. Daniel's mansion. She had avoided it for months, but today, something felt different. Perhaps it was the quiet desperation of her loneliness, or the nagging bitterness that had settled deep within her heart. She stopped at the end of the street, staring up at the enormous house. It was even grander than she had imagined, a monument to Daniel's success. It was surrounded by a wrought iron fence, towering and sleek, a stark contrast to the modest life she had lived. The manicured lawn gleamed in the sunlight, the house's high windows reflecting a life of luxury that felt so distant from her own. And yet, as Mary stood there, gazing at the house, something stirred inside her. A spark, a flicker of defiance. For the first time since Daniel had pushed her away, she felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just looking at his mansion, she was looking at the life he had built, the life he had built without her. And in that moment, she realized that she could do more than just accept this. What if I could show him? She thought. What if I could show him that I'm not a burden, that I am still strong, still capable, and that I'm not defined by my bank account or my humble lifestyle? The thought came like a sudden, forceful wave, washing away the feelings of helplessness that had consumed her for so long. It was like a switch had flipped. For years, Mary had lived for her family, for Daniel, for everyone else. Now it was time for her to live for herself. She didn't have to be invisible. She didn't have to be the forgotten one in the background. And she certainly didn't have to let Daniel's rejection define who she was. Mary stood there for what felt like hours, but in truth it was only a few moments. But in those few moments everything changed. The seed of revenge had been planted, not out of spite, but out of the need to reclaim her dignity, her strength, and her identity. She wasn't just going to let this moment of betrayal break her. She was going to rise from it. She was going to show Daniel and herself that she could still stand tall. But how? That question lingered as Mary turned and began walking back home, her mind racing with possibilities. What could she do to show her son that his cruelty had consequences? How could she prove that she was more than just the woman he thought was too poor to visit? The answer wasn't immediately clear, but one thing was certain. Mary wasn't going to fade away. She wasn't going to let him think she was some relic of the past, to be ignored and forgotten. No. She was going to make sure that Daniel would never forget what he had done to her. And when he least expected it, when he thought everything was settled and life was moving on, that's when he would learn. And he would learn the hard way. Mary's mind raced with possibilities as she walked back to her modest home that afternoon, the mansion still fresh in her thoughts. She knew she couldn't live with the humiliation any longer, not just for her own dignity, but for the belief that her worth wasn't tied to her bank account. The more she thought about Daniel's words, the more she felt the familiar sting of betrayal. But it wasn't just the words anymore. It was the realization that this wasn't just about one moment. It was about years of sacrifice that had gone unappreciated. He had taken her love, her support, her time, and now he was throwing it all away like it meant nothing. But Mary had a different plan. One that would not only prove to Daniel that she wasn't someone to be dismissed, but would also reclaim her life, her power, and her worth. She wasn't going to wait for him to come crawling back with an apology. She wasn't going to wait for him to regret his actions. Instead, she was going to show him that she could live a life beyond his judgment, one that would make him regret ever thinking she was too poor to be in his presence. So she made a decision that would change everything. Mary didn't tell anyone, not her daughter, not a single soul. She didn't need anyone's approval. She took the money she had saved over the years, money she had put away for moments just like this, and sold her small home. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and now it would serve a greater purpose. She used the proceeds to buy a house. Not just any house, but the house next door to Daniel's mansion. It was bigger, more modern, more luxurious than the place Daniel had so proudly built for himself. It had a sprawling garden, marble floors, and an expansive view that made Daniel's mansion seem small in comparison. Mary knew that this move would not just change her life. It would change Daniel's entire perception of her. No one knew what she had planned, not even Lily, who had been worried about her mother's well-being. Mary didn't need anyone to understand her decisions. Not yet. She knew that this was her moment. She wasn't going to sit idly by and let Daniel's callousness define her. She wasn't going to live in the shadow of his success, just hoping for a sliver of his attention. She was going to make her own way. When the for sale sign went up in front of the new house, Mary felt a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. It was like the weight that had been dragging her down for so long was suddenly lifted. The house was hers now, and the moment Daniel saw that sign he would know. The message would be loud and clear. Mary wasn't going to fade away. She was going to stand tall, and she was going to do it on her own terms. It didn't take long for Daniel to notice the for sale sign in front of the house next door to his. He'd been so absorbed in his own world, so sure of his newfound wealth and success, that he hadn't paid much attention to his mother's quiet life. But as soon as he saw the sign, something shifted in him. He thought it was a joke. Perhaps someone had bought the house, maybe even one of his friends, to turn it into another vacation rental or investment property. But then, a few days later, Daniel heard that the buyer was none other than his mother. The news hit him like a punch to the gut. Mary, his mother, the same woman he had dismissed so cruelly, the same woman he had told was too poor to visit his mansion. It was surreal. Daniel tried to brush it off, but a sense of unease began to settle in his chest. What was she doing buying a house like that? Why would she suddenly have the means to live in a home far grander than the one he had built? The more he thought about it, the more questions piled up in his mind, each one more uncomfortable than the last. His initial disbelief was replaced by an undeniable sense of dread. A few weeks later, Mary moved into the house. She didn't make a grand announcement or parade around the neighborhood. She simply moved in. Quietly, with dignity, and with a sense of calm authority that stunned those around her. Daniel didn't see her at first. He didn't know what to think. How could this be happening? How did she manage this? But when he finally saw her, his mother, the woman he had once considered insignificant, sitting on the front porch of her new home, his perception of her changed forever. She wasn't just sitting there. She was living. She looked comfortable, confident, and at peace with herself. She was no longer the timid woman who had been pushed aside by her own son. It was a moment of silent revenge. Mary didn't have to say a word. She didn't need to remind him of the cruel things he had said, or the way he had treated her. Her actions spoke louder than anything she could have said. She wasn't poor anymore. She wasn't weak. She wasn't invisible. And Daniel, in that moment, knew it. He knew that she was no longer the woman he had dismissed. She was stronger than he ever imagined. The contrast between their two lives was stark. He had everything. His mansion, his wealth, his high-powered job. But Mary? She had something far more valuable. Her dignity, her independence, and her ability to reclaim her place in the world. Something that Daniel could never buy, no matter how much money he had. As Daniel stood there, looking at Mary, he realized just how deeply he had underestimated her. His mother wasn't a burden. She wasn't someone to be tossed aside. She was someone who had always been there for him. Always giving, always sacrificing. And now she had taken everything he had done to her, turned it around, and created something for herself that Daniel could never take away. He had thought that he could buy his way out of his own guilt, that his wealth would shield him from the consequences of his actions. But the truth hit him like a cold slap in the face. It was his own actions that had led him here. He had pushed away the one person who had always been there for him, the one person who had supported him through everything. And now she was stronger than ever, with a life that was a far cry from the one he had once thought was beneath her. This was no longer just about Mary's revenge. It was about Daniel coming face to face with the reality of his own selfishness, and the cost of it. Daniel couldn't believe what he was seeing. There was no way this could be happening. He had always thought of himself as the one in control. After all, he had worked hard to create this life of success, wealth, and status. He had outgrown the simple life Mary had led, and in his mind, his triumphs were proof that he was the one who had earned respect, who deserved admiration. But now, standing across the street from her new mansion, Daniel felt something that shocked him to his core: humiliation. The woman he had dismissed as too poor, too insignificant, had turned the tables on him in a way he hadn't seen coming. The very mother who had once been the quiet foundation of his life now stood in the position of power. She was not just surviving. She was thriving, and in a way that felt like a quiet yet powerful act of defiance against everything he had taken for granted. At first, Daniel tried to convince himself that it didn't bother him. It was just a house. His mind told him that he had earned everything he had, and Mary's success, no matter how it had come about, was nothing to him. But deep inside, Daniel could not shake the gnawing feeling of having lost something important, something he didn't realize he valued until now. He was furious at her for doing this behind his back, furious that she had dared to challenge him, to rise above the place he had assigned for her. For so long, he had been the one to call the shots. And now it was as if the rug had been pulled out from under him. Mary had outdone him, and it wasn't just the house. It was everything he had ever believed about their relationship. This wasn't about wealth anymore. This wasn't about houses or money. This was about their relationship, and how it had been built on selfishness, pride, and a deep-seated belief that Mary would always be there, no matter how he treated her. He had used her, taken her support for granted, thinking she would never leave him, never find her strength. But now it was clear, she had found her power, and Daniel was left to face the truth of how he had treated the one person who had always stood by him. But even in his anger, Daniel knew something had shifted. He was no longer the son who had been adored, the one who had been the center of Mary's world. Mary had taken back what was hers, her dignity, her worth, and her place in this world. And Daniel felt that loss more than anything. He had taken her love for granted, and now she was making him pay the price. Unable to ignore the swelling resentment building within him, Daniel couldn't take it anymore. One afternoon, unable to stomach the idea of Mary living right next door, he stormed over to her new house. His footsteps were heavy with anger, his mind racing with the words he would say to make her understand how wrong this was. How dare she challenge him like this? When he arrived, he found Mary sitting on her porch, a cup of tea in her hand, watching the neighborhood go by with a calm expression. She didn't even look surprised to see him, which only infuriated him more. She was so calm, so composed. Was this her victory lap? Did she think she had one? "Mom," Daniel began, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "We need to talk. This is insane. You bought a house right next to mine. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've made everything worse. You can't just do this. You can't just come into my world like this." Mary didn't flinch. She simply set her cup down and looked at him, her gaze steady but warm. She knew what was coming. She had prepared herself for this moment, and she wasn't going to let him take the control back from her. "What's so insane about it, Daniel?" Mary replied, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of all the years of sacrifice she had put into her family. "I didn't need your approval to live my life. I didn't need your permission to take control of my future. I did this for myself. For the person I used to be, the one who cared about her family more than anything, the one who gave everything she had, and got nothing in return. That woman is gone now. I'm not the same person who took your insults, your dismissals, and your lack of respect. I'm stronger than that. And it's time for you to see that." Daniel stood there, his mouth slightly agape, at a loss for words. This wasn't the response he had expected. He had anticipated her to break down, to apologize, to somehow beg for his forgiveness. But Mary wasn't begging. She wasn't apologizing. She was standing there, unbroken, unshaken, and confident in her own right. "I never wanted you to feel this way," Daniel stammered, his voice cracking slightly as guilt began to creep in. He hadn't expected to feel remorse, but now, standing in front of her, he did. "I didn't mean to push you away. I've built this life, and I thought—" Mary cut him off, her voice firm but not unkind. "You thought I was a burden, Daniel. You thought that everything I had done for you wasn't worth anything anymore. You thought I was nothing more than an extra mouth to feed. But look at me now. Look at where I am. And you're right. I am not the same woman you used to know. I've changed. And I didn't need your approval to do it." For the first time, Daniel saw her, not as his mother, not as the woman he had used to take care of everything, but as a person. A woman who had lived a life of sacrifice, who had given so much, and who had finally decided to take it back. It wasn't just about the house. It was about the emotional distance, the realization that Mary was no longer the woman he could push aside. And in that moment, Daniel understood the truth. Mary had always been strong. She had just been waiting for the right time to show it. The silence between them grew, heavy with the unspoken truth of everything that had happened between them. Daniel's anger began to ebb, replaced by something else, something he hadn't expected to feel: regret. As the weeks turned into months, life began to settle into a rhythm for Mary that was both peaceful and profoundly transformative. The quiet mornings in her new home were filled with a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. The house, with its elegant details and vast space, became more than just a place to live. It became a symbol of her reclamation. Every room she walked through, every corner she turned, reminded her that she had done this for herself. She had taken control of her life again, and it was hers to shape, as it should have always been. Mary had spent years prioritizing the needs of others, sacrificing her own comfort and desires for the happiness of her family. But now, as she stood in the kitchen, preparing her morning tea in a space that felt completely her own, she couldn't help but smile. This house wasn't just a material possession. It was freedom. It was independence. It was the culmination of all the love, strength, and wisdom that she had spent her life cultivating. No longer would she define herself by the expectations others had placed upon her. Her days were filled with small joys. Long walks in the garden, visits to friends she hadn't seen in years, and evenings spent with a book or a glass of wine on her porch, watching the sun set over her new home. For the first time in a long time, Mary was living for herself, without the shadow of judgment or the expectation of others hanging over her. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of loneliness, particularly when the old wounds resurfaced, those memories of sacrifice, of being overlooked, of giving so much and getting so little in return. But as each day passed, Mary found herself healing in ways she never thought possible. She found joy in the simple things, and in doing so, she rediscovered a part of herself she had long since buried under the weight of family obligations. The independence she had gained didn't mean she had forgotten her family. It just meant that she had stopped letting them define her happiness. And that, in itself, was a victory. She had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, to be proud of who she was, and to embrace the fact that her worth was never tied to her son's opinion or anyone else's approval. While Mary's life flourished, Daniel's was quietly unraveling. At first, he tried to maintain his usual life. He threw himself into his work, his lavish lifestyle, and the day-to-day demands of his new life with his wife. But something wasn't right. Every time he looked out of the window of his mansion, he saw Mary's house standing strong and serene. It was a constant reminder that his mother had found her own peace, her own place in the world, something he had never expected. First, Daniel tried to downplay it. He tried to convince himself that he had done nothing wrong, that this was just a phase Mary was going through, that the tension between them would eventually dissipate. But the longer Mary thrived in her new home, the more Daniel began to feel a gnawing sense of discomfort. He had always believed that his wealth, his success would solve everything, that it would make him untouchable. But now, as he watched his mother not just survive, but live with a confidence he had never seen before, he began to question everything he had taken for granted. He had never truly understood the impact of his actions on her. He had taken for granted that she would always be there, always give everything for him. But as Mary embraced her new life, Daniel saw a truth he could no longer ignore. He had treated her like an accessory to his success, a background figure in his life. He had taken her love and devotion as a given, never once considering how deeply his words, his judgments, had wounded her. Months passed, and though Daniel made attempts to reach out, texts, calls, even visits to her new home, he found that the space between them had grown far too wide to bridge. The trust, the bond they had once shared, was gone. Mary didn't need him the way she once had. She didn't need his approval, his validation, or his apology. And Daniel, despite his efforts to make amends, realized something deeply painful. It wasn't that Mary was unwilling to forgive him. It was that she no longer needed him to. She had found a new kind of strength, one that came from within, not from him. But even without a grand apology, something shifted within Daniel. As he watched his mother move on, as he watched her embrace her new life with grace and resilience, he began to realize the magnitude of his mistakes. It was a quiet realization, one that crept up on him slowly, but it was there, heavy and undeniable. He had underestimated her, underestimated the depth of her strength, her resilience, her capacity to rise from the ashes of his neglect. And while Daniel never fully understood or apologized for the cruelty he had shown her, he learned something far more valuable. A lesson about humility, about the fragility of relationships, and the importance of family. He came to understand that wealth and success couldn't buy love or respect. It couldn't fix broken relationships or erase the wounds inflicted by carelessness. And as he looked at his own life, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret, not for the mansion he had built, but for the family he had neglected. Daniel began to see Mary, not just as his mother, but as a person. A woman who had spent her life loving and giving. A woman who had shown him the meaning of strength in a way he had never understood. And while he could never undo the damage he had done, he started to reevaluate his own life. He thought about the love he had been given, the family he had ignored, and the price of his pride. But the change wasn't immediate. The road to redemption for both of them was long and uncertain. Mary didn't need Daniel to apologize. She had already healed. She had already found peace. But for Daniel, the road to understanding was just beginning. And though he may never fully grasp the depth of his mother's pain, he would never forget the lesson she had taught him. As Mary's journey comes to an end, we're left with one powerful question. What would you do if your own child rejected you? What if, after all the years of love, sacrifice, and devotion, they told you that you were too poor to be part of their life? Would you stay silent, allowing their cruel words to tear you apart? Or would you take a stand and prove that your worth is not defined by anyone but you? For Mary, the choice was clear. She didn't choose silence. She chose to rise. She chose to show her son that no amount of money or success could ever erase the strength, dignity, and self-respect that she had worked so hard to build. But it wasn't just about her revenge. It was about reclaiming her life, her happiness, and her place in this world. And now I want to hear from you. How would you react if you were in Mary's shoes? Would you let the pain of rejection fester? Or would you stand up and prove to yourself, and to everyone else, that your worth cannot be measured by someone else's standards? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you would handle a situation like this. Also, if you felt moved by Mary's strength, if her journey of betrayal and silent revenge resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and share it with anyone who needs to hear a story of resilience, strength, and redemption. This isn't just Mary's story. It's a story that we all can relate to. A reminder that no matter what happens, we can rise above the hurt and reclaim our power. If you want more emotional stories like this, stories about family drama, heartbreaks, betrayal, and silent revenge, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. These are the stories that show us our own strength and teach us the power of overcoming adversity. Together we can support one another through the toughest moments, because in the end, we all deserve to live with dignity, self-respect, and love.